Hello everyone and welcome back. So you might be aware if you follow me on Twitter and or Instagram, I already shot this video. It did not go well. I basically did a blow-by-blow of all of the different features of Wonderdraft and how to use them, and it was pretty comprehensive and informative, but whoo boy was it boring. Yeah, I just did not like it. Pretty much as soon as I finished shooting it, I was like, well, that was a waste of a day because I'm not posting that on my channel. So I found myself with this problem, how to make a video for you guys about map making using Wonderdraft while keeping to the sort of lighter, laid back, kind of loosey-goosey, slimy-wimey, timey-sublimey style of my channel, and making sure I'm not just droning on about tools and features like some really dull explainer video. Not that there's anything wrong with explainer videos, I'm not trying to throw shade to you guys who make explainer videos. Luckily, I had an idea. I was going to find myself a bona fide, a real legitimate map making person and ask them to show me and you how to make maps, map mapping. Enter the savior of the video, the founder of the feast. What's that from? Oh, it's from Muppets Christmas Carol. Founder of the feast. That was meant to be Miss Piggy. Enter Domino44. If you don't know who Domino44 is, she is a very talented map maker person, cartographer, map artist.
So when I want to sound fancy, I call myself a fantasy cartographer, or even a professional fantasy cartographer.
Yes, that. She makes fantasy and sci-fi maps of all kinds, from epic Tolkien-esque hand-drawn world maps to cool isometric dungeon guides to galactic star charts. This is the real deal. She was kind enough to nerd out with this humble homebrew hobbyist about maps, geography, world building, fantasy art, and all the things we love here at Hitherto Brew.
So fantasy has always been a love of mine. One of the first memories that I can really remember being drawn to fantasy, especially the maps, was when my older siblings were reading Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia, and it was even before I could read. But what I could do is I could go through and flip through the pages, especially whatever illustrations were in the book, but also the map. And so I was able to travel to those places before I could even read about those places.
She also had some top-notch tips and techniques to share with us amateur map makers, and that is what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so I've got Wonderdraft open on my screen here, and before I even begin, Domino had some advice for the shape and the placement of landmasses on my map.
So first off, with the map shape and the ones that I see being overused, which is half landmass, half water. So you have half the page being your land and half the page being water. And this goes back to Tolkien because it's what he did first. C.S. Lewis with the Chronicles of Narnia, his map is also like that. And I'm sure there's a plethora of other ones. Typically there's like a mystical area past the water of more landmass. And even though this works really well, it's not that practical when you think about how naturally different continents are formed and the boundaries of those continents are formed. It's usually not in a square. The other map that I see way too often is what I call a square landmass. The immediate map that comes to mind for that is Game of Thrones. I'm sure there's other examples of that, but it basically seems like somebody filled as much of the paper as they could with landmass, and so it ended up looking square, which is also not how most landmasses are created. So instead of trying to do those square or half on, half off, try and think diagonally, try and think a full continent with an interesting shape, and try to keep certain areas more water, certain areas less water. And if you want a land that is connected to another piece of land that you could travel to, but you don't want to show that land on the map, try and make sure there's a natural barrier, a magical barrier, whatever you want to do that keeps you and the people in the main landmass from venturing off to that other place. The real world comparison I would do for that is India, because India's got a really interesting shape and the borders around India are all mountains, and so they didn't have the capability to travel across those easily, which is what made their natural shape.
Using the landmass brush here, I painted out the rough shape for my landmass, and then I used the raise and lower landmass tools to go in and roughen up the edges and better define the shape to look more like a natural coastline. When you're creating, I guess, like we were talking about there with your different shapes, your interesting shapes of landmass, are there any particular pieces of advice that you have for creating something that looks a bit more realistic or a bit more natural, I guess?
So that one's a harder one because kind of the more textured and odd it is, the more natural it kind of looks to all of us. And sometimes being unnatural is the way to be natural. We go down a pretty deep dive for that one too, because that has a lot of different elements that impact whether or not your land grows or gets eroded away. And those include things like the melting of glaciers, whether or not you have tides and how strong the tides are, and how, again, your plate tectonics work, whether or not you have strong storms that come through that area, which would bring in the water instead of push out the land. So there's a lot of different levels to that.
Usually what I would do next is think about putting down mountains and rivers. Our land masses are going to be largely shaped by the formation of mountains and mountain ranges. So I like to think of the mountains as the bones of the landmass, and that's sort of generally how I approach making them. But actually Domino changed my thinking about this, and she had some really great advice about making mountains. I sort of think of mountains as being like the bones of the land, you know, so if you're building up this sort of skeleton and this whole body, you need to have the bone structure of it. So you would have usually like a column of like some kind of a mountain range that goes more or less in the same direction as the land itself is being pulled up out of the sea, right? Because it's the movement of tectonic plates and things like that form the mountains.
Okay, so I mean, it's not necessarily incorrect. I wouldn't encourage people to go directly in the middle, okay? Most of our larger land masses, the mountains are formed by two plates pushing up against each other. And that almost always happens at the placement of the plates coming together, right? So you look at the Rocky Mountains in the US, which are huge and crazy, because if you look at the US or even North America down to South America, basically has mountains the entire way right against the water. Whereas India, a lot of people think that India got pushed into the land of Asia and that created those mountains. And the other thing, there's three types of mountains. There's a fold mountain, fault back mountains, and volcanic mountains. And that's in our world. You could have magical mountains that were built because the building up of different magic systems, things like that. You can get creative with it, but you should have a basis of laws of why it happened. And those laws don't have to make sense in our world. They just have to make sense in your world.
So I've used Wonderdraft's symbol tab here to select some mountains and very quickly and easily paint them on, following the guidelines that Domino talked about. I'll be using the same method of painting forests on when I get to that point as well, and Wonderdraft makes that really, really easy to do. As part of thinking about where your mountains are going to be, this is a good time to start thinking about rivers and other bodies of fresh water. I know this is also one of those things that you can go down a very deep rabbit hole of how river formations work in your world, and you can make different justifications and things. Would you say there are any sort of critical rules to know before you begin lacing rivers, and just a couple of maybe of the obvious mistakes that you could avoid making?
So, obvious mistakes for rivers are when rivers cut through landmass. You can't have, or it doesn't happen in our world. I'm not saying you can't do it if you have reasons to, where it cuts from one end of a continent into another end, because where would that collect? It's a channel then, it's not a river. And even channels aren't usually long and thin. They have different bends and stuff like that. Rivers almost always come from a highland, so mountains, you can do hills, and then it pushes itself down towards the sea.
Is that pretty much always via the most direct route?
That's
Sort
a
of
harder question to
path
answer.
path of least resistance type thing, you know, where...
Yes, that's a better way to say it. Yep.
Mm-hmm.
Softer land, things like that, where there's less rock, or there's already been a channel dug there via different natural occurrences. Typically for rivers, they have one outlet to the sea or ocean, but they can have several branches to highlands, and then those branches converge into one that forms into the outlet to the ocean. The other thing about a lot of maps that I get is an overuse of deltas. And I'm not saying that you can't have a delta in your world, you definitely can, but sometimes I get one that has like 5 deltas in it, and that's simply extremely unlikely. So deltas basically are when you get to the part of the river that flows into the sea, and that part of the river is broken off into like a branch. So the most famous delta would be the Nile, but you also have Mississippi as a delta, and Ganges River. Like, you have a lot of deltas that are pretty famous in our world, but they're the most famous for a reason. Deltas are formed when a river carries settlement down the river, and it builds up over time and creates the different pockets of land in between. And typically it's an older river that forms that way too. Most of the time the rivers cut inward. If you're adding a delta, the land would be jutting outwards most of the time. So it would be slightly pushing that sediment out towards the sea.
So Wonderdraft also lets you very easily paint in rivers and even generates those natural curves of the paths that they take as well. There are a few sliders to manipulate and control how much the river curves, how wide it is, and whether or not you want it to taper off at the source. It does take a little bit of experimenting with to get this to work exactly right, but once you get the hang of it, it's actually quite useful. Having placed our mountains and rivers, we now know where there is going to be the most water on our landmass, and that pretty much informs everything else that we do here, from the placement and density and type of forests to the existence of deserts and marshlands, and importantly to the placement of our people and their towns and their cities.
So most of the time in our world, people settled close to water for a lot of very basic reasons. We can't survive very long without water. We can grow plants easier in water, and if you're a hunter-gatherer, other animals are closer to water. We also used water as a big means of transportation as far as, you think about especially the Mediterranean, and why it was so easy for those areas to cultivate so fast is because they could hop on a boat, transport their goods on a boat across the sea, and sell it there. Whereas a lot of other places would have to have however many camel or horses or anything that would have to trek across miles of land to get to another area that would want to buy those things. So if you want to think about that, how easy is it for these people to go from place to place? And the other thing I want to touch on that is the other things that rivers really utilized for is mills, specifically wood mills, because they could cut their logs upriver from a main city and then just push them down the river. All of these things that people in our world were creative enough to come up with, people in your world should be creative too.
You can use Wonderdraft's symbols to stamp on your towns and cities like I have here, and it's very easy to import other asset packs into Wonderdraft as well. In fact, I'll show you how to do this later. Now that we have our landmass, its mountains, its rivers, forests and settlements, we just have to decide how we present the information represented on the map. Colouring and labelling are going to be our main way of doing this. And Domino also had some really useful pieces of advice in regards to this.
Yeah, so first off, for color, what I like to think about is what tone is this map going to represent? Do we want a tone that feels more rustic? Do we want it to feel more futuristic? Do we want it to feel really polished? What do you prefer? Do you want something that feels artistic? Do you want something that feels like somebody in your world created the map? And so I think you should think of it that way. Also, if you want to, look at examples, okay? Look at how different people around our world created maps. If you find inspiration, use the colors they used. I use Photoshop, so if I don't like the color, it's pretty easy for me to go and change it and work with it. And if I really don't like it, I just turn it off and just do a black and white map. Because I love black and white maps. I think they're beautiful. And then for labeling, which can be a pretty daunting area because depending on how much you've already piled into your map, it might get cluttered. One of the things that I encourage people to do is think about labeling as you're building the map. Try to keep your cities a little bit further apart from each other just so you can label them a little bit better. Add an outer glow that is similar to the background of your map so it pops out a little bit. The other thing I do for really important areas is I'll put a banner or a scroll there so that it really pops out to you. So depending on what you want to convey in that specific map, label it. All right, if it's super important for the world, label it. If it's super important to your story, label it so that your audience doesn't get lost. And if you really want to go further in, make more maps, make regional maps. And in those regional maps, it's easier to label those little things because those little things look bigger. One of the best examples of that is actually the book series Wheel of Time, where he actually made several different maps. One of the first maps you see in the series is actually just their little town. And then as you progress, he kind of expands the world. He doesn't label every single forest, river, and mountain range in his big map. But if you want that, you go to the regional map. Yeah, we all get stuck in that. Again, I'm going to talk about it probably a few more times, is that deep dive world building. And how important is it for you to show how much you know about your world? But really, it's more important to show what's most important about your world.
Wonderdraft by default only has a limited set of brushes, but at least for my purposes, I've never found I've needed anything more than what was here. You can change the opacity and the intensity of the color brush, which gives you a simple but quite flexible way of manipulating your palette of colors. I must say I'm quite happy with what I've achieved here in a relatively short space of time. Now hopefully with the very helpful advice of Domino44 and with a toolkit like Wonderdraft as your starting off point, you'll be able to create some really great maps for your games. If you do, I'd love to see them, so shout me out on Twitter or Instagram with any of your creations. Of course, if you are looking for something with a bit more expertise behind it, maybe for a map that you'd like to print or for a larger project that you really want to stand out, you really can't beat a professional map making person.
Fantasy cartographer.
Domino, I'm just going to thank you once more for joining us. That's been really helpful, and I know that the people who watch are going to be very pleased that I've actually got someone who knows what they're doing to talk to them about things for once. So thanks so much for coming along.
No worries, I had a blast. I love talking about maps. So having somebody that's actually digesting what I say, it's cool for me.
Nice. Okay, good. Well, I'm glad that I can provide that for you at least. Before I let you go, is there anything that you'd like to plug, and where can people find you?
Yeah, so I am on Instagram, Twitter, I have a website, and I'm on Patreon. But most of my work is done for commercial purposes right now. I have a few commissions that I'm working on, and I want to really build myself into a place where I can pretty much support myself on mapping. And I'm really loving the journey that I get to go on with different creators and creative minds that might not have the artistic skills that I have, which is super cool. Oh, and if I could, I want to plug two things. So the first thing would be Cartographers Guild. And I joined that pretty early on in my map making endeavors. There's just a huge basis of knowledge. There's tutorials on if you want to build your maps by hand. There's a bunch of really talented people there that are more than willing to give you their expertise. The other thing I want to plug is somebody I met on Cartographers Guild who is an insanely talented map maker, who's John Stevenson. He's been kind of like a mentor to me in a lot of ways. If I have a question, he's always getting back to me and making sure that I get what I need, which is incredibly helpful. So check him out too. And cartography community is insanely supportive, so they're all pretty awesome.
Massive thank you to Domino44 for agreeing to help me out with this and share her hard-earned trade secrets with us all. Please do go and show her some love. She did tell me that she is currently up to her eyes in commissions, but she is happy to take inquiries and schedule in projects for later. You'll find her info in the description below. I really encourage you to take a look. She does amazing work. As I alluded to before, it turned out as we were chatting that she was incredibly knowledgeable about a lot of the things that we like to talk about here on this channel. So she may drop by again when we get to talking about world building and all of the different facets of that in future deep dive videos.
Yeah, so I encourage people, Google the way that our world works, because that's the only real baseline example we have. And then if you want to break some of those rules, just come up with creative reasons. And also, if you're going to add things like magic or different types of people, all of those things are going to have a huge effect on your world, and you need to treat it as a big effect. I think a lot of people actually don't change enough. They go too small instead of too big. So I encourage people to go bigger than smaller. Yeah, make it interesting. Add different elements. Give yourself some new rules. Add a different star chart. If you want a star chart, hit me up because I love making those. You could have your whole continent be formed by volcanic mountains. Who says you can't? Maybe you have a thinner Earth crust, so everything's warmer. I don't know. You can make those decisions.
Now, before I close out, I am going to show you guys one more thing in Wonderdraft, how to import more assets. The sets that come with Wonderdraft as standard are pretty decent, and they've released a couple of extra packages in the last couple of years. But if you're looking for something more and you want to know how to port them into the software, it couldn't be easier. I've got an asset pack here from 2 Minute Tabletop that I've downloaded from their website and saved to my desktop. All I need to do is take this whole asset folder here and place it in a specific directory in the Wonderdraft files. To find this directory, you simply need to open up Wonderdraft, go up here to the menu and select Open User Folder. This will open up the exact folder that you're looking for. Click and drag your new assets in here, and once they have copied over, you can go back to Wonderdraft to the Assets tab up at the top there, and you can see all of my imported assets there. So make sure you've got a little check mark next to the ones that you want to be active. Then all you need to do is open up a new project in Wonderdraft and your assets will be loaded in. Easy. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm sorry that this video was a little bit later than planned in getting to you, but I'm sure you'll agree that what we ended up with is leaps and bounds better than this.
As far as I'm aware, it usually preserves the settings that you last put in the last time that you made a map.
Next week, we'll be rounding off our conversation about quest design for your games as we get into managing the stages of a quest and how to make sure your party has a sense of purpose and direction throughout. Until then, as always, stay safe and happy adventuring.
Because, I'm sorry, nobody cared that an internal year-long winters and year-long summers didn't make sense in Game of Thrones until Game of Thrones didn't make sense.
Yeah.
You know,
that's a whole other thing.
Cared. We all loved it until we didn't. But we didn't care that it didn't make sense. So sometimes it's okay as long as you have other things that balance it out.
Exactly. Yeah. That's a pretty good way to end it, I think. That's a good example of something that we can all agree on, which was that we loved Game of Thrones until we didn't.
Yeah, I know. Everybody's gonna be triggered at the end. Darn it.
Yeah.